The Structural Deficit by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. There is a quiet contradiction at the center of many successful financial lives, one that rarely gets named and therefore rarely gets resolved. The income is real. The effort was immense, and by every visible measure, security should have arrived by now. And yet it hasn't. Not fully. Not in the way that was expected. What this audiobook proposes is that the problem was never the income. It was always what the income was never deliberately shaped to build. By the end of this listening, the unease that brought you here will have a name, a cause, and a direction. And that, more than any number on a statement, is where genuine financial stability actually begins. There is a particular kind of Sunday evening that high earners know well, even if they've never compared notes about it. The day has been good, genuinely good. Maybe there was a meal that lingered, a moment of ease, something that felt like the life you worked toward. And then, without invitation, a quiet shift. Not panic, not crisis. Something subtler and, in many ways, more unsettling. A low, sourceless unease that settles somewhere between the chest and the back of the mind and refuses to be named. You are not broke. You know that. You are not reckless. The career has been deliberate. The effort has been real. The sacrifices were made, and they mattered. By every visible measure, the situation is fine. More than fine. And yet, something in you doesn't believe it. Something in you is scanning quietly for the thing that hasn't been handled, the exposure that hasn't been closed, the ground that isn't quite as solid as the surface suggests. You close the browser. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You move toward sleep, and the feeling moves with you. This is where many high earners live, not in financial crisis, but in a kind of financial unease that has no obvious source and therefore no obvious solution. And because it has no obvious source, it tends to get filed under the wrong category. Personality. Temperament. A tendency toward worry that successful people are supposed to have outgrown by now. Consider what it took to reach this income level. The years of compounding effort, the decisions made under pressure, the opportunities pursued, and the comfort zones abandoned. There was a quiet assumption running beneath all of it, reasonable, even logical, that financial security would arrive as a natural consequence of financial success. That one day the number would be high enough, the career stable enough, the lifestyle established enough, and the unease would simply stop. It would have nothing left to feed on. It would go quiet, but it didn't. And that, more than any spreadsheet, is the thing worth paying attention to. The more honest version of this experience, the one that rarely gets said out loud, is that the settling never fully came. Income rose, and the anxiety recalibrated. Lifestyle expanded, and the exposure found new surface area. The destination kept moving. Not because the person was failing, but because they were chasing the wrong thing and calling it the right one. And admitting that feels like an uncomfortable betrayal. Because if financial security isn't the natural outcome of financial success, then what was all of it for? That question deserves to be held carefully, because it is not a pessimistic one. It is a precise one. It is the question that separates people who keep running the same race from people who finally stop to ask whether the race was ever going to end where they thought it would. Morgan Housel wrote that wealth is what you don't see. It is a simple observation, but it carries a weight that compounds the longer you sit with it. Because what most high earners have built is highly visible. The income, the lifestyle, the professional identity, the outward markers of success. What they haven't built is largely invisible, and invisible gaps don't announce themselves. They simply wait. The assumption that has done the most quiet damage is not extravagance. It is not ignorance. It is the assumption that the discomfort is personal, that this feeling of exposure is a character flaw, some variant of anxiety or ingratitude or psychological limitation, rather than accurate feedback from a system that was never fully designed to produce security. That is an important distinction, because a character flaw calls for self-improvement. A structural signal calls for structural response. And confusing the two means spending years working on the wrong thing, while the actual problem continues, undisturbed, beneath the surface. This is the moment worth sitting in. Not the income figure, not the account balance. This moment, the one where the possibility opens that what you've been experiencing is not a failure of character, but a signal about design. That the question isn't, what is wrong with you? The question is, what is missing from the system you've been operating inside? The real question, the one that tends to stay unasked because asking it feels like standing at the edge of something, is simply this: why doesn't it feel like enough? Not as an accusation, not as an indictment of the effort or the achievement or the life that's been built, but as a genuine, quiet, honest inquiry. Because that question, followed with patience and without defensiveness, leads somewhere useful. It leads toward a clarity that no additional income on its own has ever managed to provide. That clarity begins here. The belief is so embedded that it rarely gets examined. It sits beneath the financial decisions, beneath the career ambitions, beneath the quiet hope that the next raise, the next contract, the next level of income will finally produce the thing that all the previous levels promised but didn't quite deliver. The belief is this: that financial security is what happens when financial success reaches a sufficient threshold, that the unease is a temporary condition, that more income is the medicine, and the only question is dosage. It is worth saying clearly, this belief is not foolish. It is the logical conclusion of a professional life that consistently rewarded income growth. Every stage of the career confirmed it. Work harder, earn more, feel more stable. The pattern held, at least on the surface, for long enough to become a conviction. And convictions that have been reinforced over years don't dissolve easily, even when the evidence quietly begins to contradict them. Most people don't notice the contradiction because they're still inside the pattern, still climbing, still believing the next level will be the one that finally settles things. But here is where the belief begins to break down, not dramatically, but precisely. Income is a measure of flow. It tells you how much is moving through the system at any given time. What it does not tell you, what it was never designed to tell you, is how much is being held, shaped, protected, or made durable. A river with no banks moves impressively. It does not accumulate. And a financial life organized entirely around the strength of its flow, without deliberate attention to what contains and directs that flow, produces the same result: impressive movement, and very little that holds. The metaphor that makes this concrete is an uncomfortable one. Increasing income to resolve financial insecurity, when the real problem is structural, is like turning up the water pressure to fix a leaking pipe. The force increases, the volume increases, and the damage increases proportionally, because the underlying problem was never addressed. The leak continues, now with greater intensity, while the surface of the house remains dry enough to avoid obvious alarm. This is how high earners can spend a decade growing their income and arrive surprised to find that their sense of security has not grown with it. The pressure was high. The architecture was never fixed. There is a specific illusion worth naming here, because it operates with quiet authority in the financial lives of many capable people. It is the illusion of proportionality, the assumption that a higher income produces a proportionally higher degree of financial security. It doesn't. A person earning $200,000 a year with no durable financial infrastructure is not twice as secure as someone earning $100,000. In many ways, they are more exposed, carrying a larger lifestyle, larger obligations, and a larger gap between what arrives and what is structurally protected. The number is bigger. The foundation is the same. And a larger structure on an incomplete foundation is not strength. It is increased surface area for risk. What makes this misdiagnosis so costly is not the single year in which it operates. It is the compounding effect of every year in which the real problem goes unaddressed while the perceived solution continues to be pursued. Every year spent optimizing income without building structure is a year the foundation remains incomplete. The exposure doesn't stay neutral during those years. It deepens quietly, invisibly, beneath a surface that continues to function and therefore to reassure. James Clear observed that you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. In financial life, this is not motivational. It is mechanical. The income was the goal. The system, the architecture beneath it, was never built to match it. Most high earners never interrogate this assumption because the immediate feedback loop doesn't demand it. The income keeps arriving. The lifestyle keeps functioning. The bills get paid, the emergencies get handled, and the system appears to be working. And an appearing to work system is extraordinarily difficult to question because questioning it feels like ingratitude or pessimism or unnecessary disruption of something that is, after all, mostly fine. The assumption only reveals itself as wrong when something disrupts the flow, a job transition, a market contraction, a health event, an unexpected obligation, and the absence of structure suddenly has nowhere left to hide. The transition this audiobook is pointing toward is not from a lower income to a higher one. That framing, however familiar, is the misdiagnosis. The transition is from measuring flow to building form, from asking how much comes in to asking what has been constructed to receive it, shape it, and make it last. Those are different questions. They require different thinking, and they produce, over time, an entirely different kind of financial life, one where the Sunday evening quiet is not interrupted by a feeling that something essential is missing because the essential work has actually been done. That work begins with understanding what was never built and why. If you have been waiting for the problem to name itself clearly, this is that moment. It is not that the income was insufficient. For most people listening to this, the income has been, by any reasonable standard, more than adequate. It is not that the spending was reckless. There may have been indulgences, as there are in any full life, but recklessness is not what created the exposure, and it is not ignorance. The high earner who feels financially uncertain is rarely uninformed. They read, they follow markets, they understand compound interest in the abstract. The problem is not a deficit of financial knowledge. It is something quieter and, in a way, more systemic than any of those explanations allow. The real problem is the absence of deliberate financial infrastructure beneath a high-performing income engine. Not the absence of income, the absence of what income, left unstructured, cannot create on its own. This distinction sounds technical until you feel the weight of it, until you recognize that the engine has been running impressively for years, and that almost nothing durable was built behind it. To understand why this happens so consistently among capable, intelligent, high-earning people, it helps to trace the system that produced them. Education rewards income optimization. Professional culture measures success in compensation. Ambition, as it is typically channeled, is directed entirely toward the question of what can be earned. From the first job to the first promotion to the current role, every signal in the environment has confirmed the same directive: perform, advance, earn more. The architecture of a financial life, the infrastructure of protection, allocation, and structural design was simply never part of the curriculum. Not because it was rejected, but because it was never introduced as the relevant problem to solve. This is the pattern, and it is invisible precisely because it hides inside the appearance of success. A rising income looks like progress. A full, active professional life looks like momentum. A capable person who handles things as they arise looks like someone in control. And in many respects, they are. But handling things as they arise is reactive architecture. It is building the house one emergency at a time, and it produces a life that functions but never quite stabilizes, because stability is not a product of response. It is a product of design. Here is the contradiction that strikes hardest. Intelligence offers no protection against this pattern. In fact, there is a specific way in which high intelligence can deepen it. The same cognitive precision that built the career, the problem-solving, the strategic thinking, the capacity to optimize under pressure was available all along to apply to financial structure. But it wasn't applied there because the career always presented itself as the more urgent problem. There was always a more immediate deadline, a more visible opportunity, a more pressing professional demand. Financial infrastructure carries no deadline. It does not send calendar reminders. It does not escalate. It simply waits, quietly, while everything more urgent gets attended to first. And so the deferral becomes the pattern. Not a decision made once, but a non-decision made repeatedly, year after year, disguised as productivity. Always earning more. Always managing the immediate. Always moving. The motion feels like progress because motion and progress are easily confused, especially when the income confirms that something is working. But working and building are not the same thing. A person can work very hard for a very long time and build very little that would survive a disruption to the income itself. That is not a judgment. It is a mechanical observation about what reactive financial management produces over time. What makes this compound is not the individual year in which the structural work doesn't happen. It is the accumulation of those years. Each one, in isolation, feels manageable. The income covered the gap. The situation resolved. The urgency passed. But quietly, below the surface, the distance between what arrives and what is durably held widens. Not catastrophically, not visibly, just persistently. In the way that a slow leak in a wall doesn't flood the house, it simply weakens it, incrementally, until the day the weakness becomes impossible to ignore. Perhaps you've been nodding along to this section in a way that feels different from the earlier ones. Not nodding at someone else's story, nodding at your own. The pattern being described here is not a rare psychological archetype. It is the predictable output of a system that optimized for income and never asked what income alone was supposed to build. Most high earners find themselves inside it not through weakness, but through the entirely reasonable act of following every incentive their environment ever gave them. The recognition, when it arrives, is not comfortable, but it is clarifying. And clarity, at this stage, is the thing that changes everything, because you cannot restructure what you haven't first honestly seen. There is a specific quality to the confidence of a high earner that is worth examining carefully, because it is real and it is incomplete at the same time. In the professional world, it is earned and justified, the result of years of demonstrated competence, of problems solved under pressure, of a career that has repeatedly confirmed capability. That confidence is not performance. It is the accumulated evidence of a person who has shown up and delivered consistently at a high level. And yet, bring that same person home, sit them quietly with their finances on a Tuesday evening, and something shifts. The confidence doesn't disappear, but it develops somewhere beneath the surface, a hairline fracture that doesn't show from the outside and is therefore never quite addressed. This is the emotional texture of living inside the structural deficit. Decisions feel slightly approximate, not wrong exactly, but not fully grounded either. Plans feel provisional, as though built on assumptions that haven't been fully tested. There is a vague sense that the financial life is being managed rather than designed, maintained rather than built, and that the difference between those two things matters more than it has been comfortable to admit. The professional self moves through the world with authority. The financial self moves through the world with something quieter and less certain. And the gap between those two experiences is where a particular kind of exhaustion takes up residence. What makes this condition especially difficult to carry is its unspokenness. The high earner who feels financially exposed cannot easily say so without encountering a wall of well-meaning incomprehension. The numbers don't support the complaint. The lifestyle doesn't suggest the struggle. And so the discomfort becomes private, filed away, rationalized, occasionally surfacing on Sunday evenings, and then submerged again beneath the week's demands. Private discomforts, left unexamined, do not resolve. They compound. They become part of the background noise of a life, always present, never loud enough to demand attention, gradually wearing down something that is difficult to name and therefore difficult to restore. Consider someone who has spent a decade earning well. Every disruption that arose, the unexpected expense, the income gap, the financial emergency, was handled, resolved through effort, through the next opportunity, through the reliable engine of a high income. From the outside, this looks like resilience. From the inside, it begins to feel, over time, like something different, because recovery and resilience are not the same thing. Recovery means returning to a prior state after disruption. Resilience means having built something durable enough that disruption cannot easily reach the foundation. A person who has spent a decade recovering is not a person who has spent a decade building. And somewhere around the middle of the story, perhaps at 40, perhaps at 45, that distinction stops being theoretical. The regret that arrives at that point is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with the clarity of a crisis. It comes quietly in the form of arithmetic, a slow recognition that years of genuine effort, real sacrifice, and meaningful professional achievement have produced a life that is full in almost every visible way, and not yet structurally sound in the ways that matter most. That is a different kind of loss than failure. Failure has a clear cause and a clear lesson. This has neither. It is the loss that comes from doing many things right and leaving one essential thing undone, and not realizing the omission until the compounding of time has made it both more visible and more costly to address. What begins to wear most is not the financial exposure itself. Numbers can be changed. Gaps can be closed. What wears most is the identity weight, the quiet burden of being a demonstrably capable, high-earning, professionally accomplished person who still, privately, does not feel financially free. And the shame that accompanies that gap is its own compounding problem, because shame forecloses honest examination. It makes the financial life a subject to be managed rather than understood, a performance to be maintained rather than a structure to be honestly assessed, and a financial life that cannot be honestly assessed cannot be honestly improved. This is the gravity of the moment, not drama, not crisis, clarity, the kind that arrives when the distance between the life you appear to be living and the life you are actually living from the inside becomes too wide to bridge with another year of the same approach. Something must shift, not at the level of income, not at the level of effort, not at the level of intention, because all of those have been present and have not resolved the condition. Something must shift at the level of understanding, at the level of how the problem is perceived, framed, and therefore addressed. That shift is what the next part of this audiobook is built to provide, not as instruction, as illumination. Some realizations don't arrive loudly. They don't come with the sharp clarity of a crisis or the obvious momentum of a breakthrough. They arrive quietly, almost gently, like a lens being adjusted, and suddenly, what was always there comes into focus in a way it never quite did before. This is one of those realizations, and it is, in many ways, the central one that this entire audiobook has been building toward. Security is not a function of income. It is a function of structure. That sentence is worth sitting with, because it is doing more work than it appears to. It is not a critique of income. It is not a suggestion that earning well is insufficient or misguided. It is a precise observation about the nature of financial security, about what it is actually made of, and therefore what is actually required to produce it. And the reason it lands with such quiet force is that most high earners have been operating for years on exactly the opposite assumption. Income and security have been treated as synonymous, two words for the same destination. They are not. They are related, but they are not the same. And the distance between them is where the structural deficit lives. Think about the nature of a river. There is something genuinely impressive about a powerful river. The force of it, the volume, the way it sustains everything around it. A high income has that quality. It moves, it provides, it resolves the immediate and enables the possible. But a river, however powerful, does not become a reservoir simply by flowing. A river, without banks, does not accumulate. It spreads, it disperses, it finds the lowest ground and disappears into it. The force that made it impressive is the same force that makes it impossible to hold. And a financial life built entirely around the strength of its river, without the deliberate architecture of banks, of containers, of structures designed to hold what the river carries, produces exactly that result. Impressive in motion. Difficult to hold. Gone in meaningful ways, before it was ever truly possessed. The reframe that follows from this is not complicated, but it changes everything about how financial decisions are perceived. The question was never how much comes in. That was always the wrong question, or rather, it was an incomplete question that the professional world elevated into the only question. The question that actually determines financial security is different. What has been built to receive what comes in, to hold it, to shape it, and to make it durable over time? That is an architectural question. It requires a different kind of thinking than income-building demands. Less about performance, more about design. Less about the strength of the flow, more about the integrity of what contains it. Once this shift in perception occurs, the financial landscape looks genuinely different. The same income, viewed through this lens, is no longer simply a performance metric. It is a resource that either flows into structure or flows through its absence. Decisions that previously felt neutral reveal themselves as architectural choices. The month in which the structural work didn't happen is not a neutral month. It is a month in which the foundation remained incomplete and the exposure quietly deepened. This is not cause for alarm. It is cause for clarity. Because clarity about what is actually happening is the only condition under which something different can begin. A high income directed into a structurally incomplete system does not accumulate. This is the mechanical truth at the center of the structural deficit. The income arrives, and in the absence of deliberate architecture to receive it, it passes through, absorbed by lifestyle, by obligation, by the endless series of present demands that a high income both enables and attracts. And passing through year after year leaves almost nothing behind that an interruption to the income cannot immediately threaten. The impressive river, it turns out, had no reservoir. And the day the river slows, through job loss, health disruption, market contraction, or any of the ordinary turbulences of a long financial life, the absence of what should have been built becomes, suddenly, uncomfortably visible. The image worth carrying is this: a house that photographs beautifully, curated, admired, apparently successful in every visible way. And somewhere above the guest room, invisible in ordinary weather, a slow leak that only reveals itself in the kind of storm that eventually finds every house. The house is not a failure. The house is genuinely lovely. But the loveliness is in the furnishings, and the problem is in the structure. And as any builder will tell you, you cannot furnish your way out of a structural problem. New furniture in a leaking room remains wet furniture. The surface can be as impressive as you like. The work has never been about the surface. This is not a discouraging truth. It is a freeing one. Because structure, unlike talent or luck or timing, is buildable, deliberately, incrementally, at any point in the story. The question is simply whether you are now ready to see the right problem clearly enough to begin. There is a difference between understanding something and feeling it land. Most people who will recognize themselves in this audiobook are not short on understanding. They can follow the logic, acknowledge the pattern, even nod at the diagnosis with a kind of tired familiarity. But understanding that sits only in the mind tends to produce more thinking rather than genuine change. What shifts behavior is not new information. It is a change in how existing reality is interpreted, a quiet reorganization of meaning that makes certain choices feel different, not because they were commanded, but because they now carry a different weight. That reorganization is what happens when the distinction between income and structure stops being a concept and becomes something felt. And the first thing it changes is not a financial decision. It is the relationship to the anxiety itself. For years, perhaps many years, the background unease that accompanied the financial life was filed under the category of personal failing, an irrational tendency, a psychological limitation that more successful thinking should have resolved by now. This interpretation, however quietly held, produced a specific and unhelpful response: self-judgment. The anxiety was treated as evidence of something wrong with the person rather than something incomplete in the system. And self-judgment, as a response to a structural problem, is worse than useless. It consumes the very energy that honest examination requires while leaving the actual problem entirely untouched. The shift is this: the anxiety was never irrational. It was accurate. A system without adequate financial infrastructure is genuinely exposed, and the mind that lives inside that system is correctly registering the exposure. The discomfort was not a character flaw broadcasting itself. It was a structural signal, precise, functional, pointing towards something real that needed attention. The difference between those two interpretations is not subtle. A character flaw calls for self-correction, for discipline, for trying harder to feel differently than you feel. A structural signal calls for design. It calls for examination, for honest assessment, for the kind of deliberate building that the earlier sections of this audiobook have been describing. One, interpretation contracts a person inward. The other opens a path forward. When this shift in interpretation takes hold, identity begins to adjust. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but something in the internal ledger changes. The metric by which financial health is quietly assessed begins to move. Income, which had always been the primary measure, begins to feel like an incomplete one. Not unimportant, incomplete. And in its place, a different question begins to carry more weight. What has actually been built beneath the income? What would remain? What would hold? What would sustain the life if the income were interrupted tomorrow? That question, asked seriously and without defensiveness, is the beginning of structural thinking. And structural thinking, once it becomes the natural mode of financial self-assessment, is genuinely difficult to reverse. This is not a decision made in a single moment of resolve. It is a reorientation, gradual, cumulative, and quietly irreversible, that begins to influence how financial choices feel before it visibly changes what those choices are. Certain decisions that previously felt neutral begin to feel like avoidance, not because a rule was broken, but because the internal framework has shifted, and avoidance now registers differently against that framework. Certain other decisions, ones that contribute to structure rather than simply managing flow, begin to feel more aligned, more like building and less like maintenance. The behavior follows the perception, not the other way around. And that sequence matters enormously because behavior that is instructed tends to be fragile, while behavior that emerges from a genuine shift in how things are perceived tends to be durable. Small things begin to change first. The way a financial decision is considered. The question asked before a choice is made. The slight pause that occurs when something feels like it is serving the lifestyle rather than the foundation. None of these are dramatic. Individually, none of them are significant. But they are happening from a different internal place than before, from a person who is now, however quietly, oriented toward building rather than simply managing. And small things done consistently from a different orientation compound into a fundamentally different financial life over time. The confidence that begins to emerge from this shift is unlike the confidence that income alone ever provided. Income-based confidence is borrowed. It depends on the income continuing, on the next payment arriving, on the flow remaining strong. It is real, but it is contingent. The confidence that comes from knowing the foundation is being attended to is different in kind. It is grounded. It does not require the income to be exceptional this month to feel stable. It is the quiet assurance of a person who has stopped measuring their security by what arrives and started measuring it by what holds. That is what changes on Sunday evenings. Not the numbers, the orientation. And orientation, sustained over time, changes everything the numbers eventually become. The shift in perception that the previous section described is real and meaningful, but perception on its own lives in the mind. What makes it durable, what gives it roots rather than just reach, is the moment it begins to touch the ordinary decisions of an ordinary day, not through a dramatic overhaul, not through a sudden restructuring of everything at once, but through the quiet, accumulating difference between decisions made from the old orientation and decisions made from the new one. Under the old orientation, financial decisions were organized around two primary questions. Can I afford this? And is this situation handled? These are not irresponsible questions. They are the natural questions of a person managing a financial life reactively, responding to what arrives, resolving what demands resolution, maintaining the lifestyle that the income has made possible. This is how most high earners operate, not through negligence, but through a perfectly logical prioritization of the immediate over the structural. The immediate always has a deadline. The structural never does. And so the immediate wins consistently year after year, while the structural work accumulates in a category called later that never quite arrives. The practical shift is not a new set of rules layered over this existing pattern. It is a change in the questions being asked. Under the new orientation, the question is no longer only what can I afford? It becomes, what does this decision build or fail to build? That reframing is subtle in language and significant in effect because it changes the unit of measurement. Affordability measures the present moment, whether the flow is sufficient to cover the cost. Architecture measures over time, whether the decision contributes to something durable or simply passes through the system without leaving a foundation behind. Both questions can be asked about the same decision. The one you ask first determines what kind of financial life you are constructing. Consider what happens to the same income under these two different orientations. Under the first, income is a resource for maintaining. It covers the costs, funds the lifestyle, resolves the emergencies, and whatever remains is loosely available until the next demand appears. Under the second, income is a resource for building. It still covers the costs and funds the life, but with a layer of deliberate direction beneath it, an awareness that where it goes determines what accumulates over time. The income hasn't changed. The life it is capable of producing over a decade is entirely different. The illusion that loses its power here is one worth naming directly because it has provided cover for financial deferral in the lives of many capable people for many years. It is the belief that more income, arriving soon enough, will eventually make the structural work unnecessary, that the next raise will create enough surplus to finally address the foundation, that the next bonus will be the one that changes the architecture. It won't. Not because the income won't arrive, but because the pattern of treating structural work as something income alone will eventually solve is precisely the pattern that created the deficit in the first place. More flow into an unstructured system does not produce structure. It produces more flow, and then more of the same exposure at a larger scale. What changes practically under the new awareness is not a list of behaviors, but a quality of attention. A slight but consistent shift in how financial choices are considered before they are made. The pause that asks not just whether something is affordable, but what it is doing, whether it is serving the surface of the life or the foundation beneath it. This is not restriction, it is direction. And direction applied consistently to the same income that was previously flowing without it produces, over time, a financial life with an entirely different structural profile. The same river, given banks, becomes something that holds. Old habits of financial deferral begin to feel different under this lens. The instinct to handle things as they arise, to rely on income recovery as the primary financial safety net, to treat infrastructure as a project for a future version of yourself who will somehow have more time and more clarity. These habits don't disappear immediately, but they begin to register differently. They begin to feel less like pragmatic productivity and more like what they actually are: postponed architecture. Deliberate delay of the foundational work, dressed in the language of managing well. Recognizing that is not self-criticism. It is precision, and precision is where change actually begins. The tone that belongs to this stage of the journey is not urgency. Urgency implies emergency, and the structural work is not an emergency. It is a priority, which is a different and more sustainable thing entirely. The tone is steadiness. The calm, adult recognition of a person who understands the problem clearly, knows that the tools to address it exist, and has resolved, not dramatically, but genuinely, to shift from income thinking to structural thinking, not someday, now. Not because the situation has become critical, but because clarity, once achieved, makes the old approach feel like something it is no longer possible to unknowingly return to. The work ahead is not overwhelming. It is simply real. And real work, approached with the right orientation, compounds in exactly the direction you have been hoping income alone would take you. There is a particular kind of relief that comes not from solving a problem, but from finally understanding what the problem actually was. It is quieter than triumph. It does not announce itself. It arrives as a settling, a sense that the ground beneath you is more solid than it was an hour ago. Not because the circumstances changed, but because the confusion did. That is where this audiobook has been moving from the beginning. Not toward a solution delivered from the outside, but toward a clarity earned from within. Return for a moment to where this began, a Sunday evening, a quiet, sourceless unease that didn't match the income, didn't match the lifestyle, didn't match any visible evidence of failure. A capable person sitting with a discomfort they couldn't name and therefore couldn't address, and concluding, in the absence of a better explanation, that the problem must be them. That conclusion, reasonable as it felt, was the misdiagnosis that everything else followed from, because a person who believes they are the problem will spend their energy on self-correction, and self-correction, applied to a structural problem, produces effort without resolution. It produces years of trying harder at the wrong thing, while the actual thing remains quietly unaddressed. You can name it now. Not a character flaw, not income insufficiency, not irrationality or ingratitude, or the psychological residue of a scarcity mindset. A structural deficit, a specific identifiable gap between a high-performing income and the deliberate financial infrastructure that gives income lasting meaning. That gap is not a moral condition. It is a design condition, and design conditions respond to design thinking, to honest assessment, to deliberate construction, to the patient work of building something beneath the surface that the surface alone was never going to produce. What this audiobook has offered, across every section, is not new information about money. It is a new lens through which existing financial reality becomes legible in a different way. The income was always there. The lifestyle was always there. The unease was always there. What was missing was a framework precise enough to explain the relationship between them, to account for why impressive flow does not automatically produce durable security, and why the absence of structure compounds quietly over time into the exact condition that so many high earners find themselves in and cannot explain. The framework now exists, and a lens, once focused, cannot be unfocused. The clarity achieved in this listening is not temporary. It is the kind of seeing that reorganizes what comes after it. The elegant compression of everything this audiobook has explored is a single sentence. Wealth is not what arrives. It is what holds. Not what flows through the system, but what the system was built to retain. Not the strength of the river, but the integrity of its banks. Not the income figure at the top of the statement, but the foundation that determines how much of that figure becomes something durable over time. This is not a clever reframing for its own sake. It is a functional truth with real consequences, because a person who measures their financial health by what arrives will always be vulnerable to the moment the arrival slows, while a person who measures it by what holds has built something that does not depend entirely on the flow continuing at its current strength. Growth that happens at the foundational level is invisible from the outside. It does not photograph well. It does not produce the visible markers that professional achievement produces: the title, the office, the lifestyle upgrade that signals progress to the people around you. Foundational growth happens quietly, in the decisions that don't make interesting stories, in the structural choices that accumulate without fanfare into something that one day simply holds under conditions that would have previously threatened everything. That invisibility is not a weakness of this kind of growth. It is its nature, and its nature is precisely why it endures when visible things do not. The person listening to this section is not the same person who pressed play at the beginning. Something has shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but genuinely and in a way that is difficult to reverse. The metric has changed. The question has changed. The internal orientation toward money, toward income, toward the financial decisions of an ordinary day has quietly reorganized around a different understanding of what financial security actually is and what it actually requires. That reorganization did not come from being told what to do. It came from seeing clearly enough that the right things began to feel obvious. What began as confusion has become clarity. What began as a vague Sunday evening unease has become a precisely named problem with a precisely understood solution. What began as tension, the tension of a capable person unable to explain their own financial anxiety, has become direction. That progression from confusion to clarity, from tension to direction, is not a small thing. It is, in the quietest and most durable sense, the beginning of a different financial life. The foundation is ready to be built. And now, for the first time, you know exactly what you are building. There is something that happens to anxiety when it is finally understood. It doesn't vanish immediately. Anxiety rarely does. But it changes in character. It loses its urgency. The low background frequency that has accompanied So many evenings and early mornings, the scanning for the unnamed thing that hasn't been handled begins to quiet. Not because the financial life has been perfected overnight, but because the signal has been received. And a signal that has been received no longer needs to repeat itself at the same volume. The anxiety was never the enemy. That is worth saying plainly, because most people who experience financial unease spend considerable energy trying to suppress it, rationalize it, or outrun it with the next income milestone. But the unease was information, accurate, consistent, pointing toward something real. It was the internal equivalent of a warning light on a dashboard, not the problem itself, but the indication of one. And like any warning light, its purpose is not to persist indefinitely. Its purpose is to be understood. Once the structural deficit is named, once the gap between income and architecture is seen clearly rather than felt vaguely, the anxiety has completed its function. It no longer needs to announce itself so insistently. The message was received. What replaces it is not euphoria. It is not the uncomplicated confidence of someone who has solved everything and knows it. It is something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It is the particular peace that comes from working on the right problem, from knowing, with genuine clarity, what you are actually addressing and why. This kind of peace does not require the work to be finished. It only requires the work to be real. A person building a foundation does not need the house to be complete to feel steadier than they did before the building began. The act of deliberate construction, oriented correctly, changes the internal experience of the financial life even before it significantly changes the external one. One of the most meaningful shifts that structural clarity produces is a changed relationship with time. Without a framework, without the sense that the foundational work is being attended to, time feels adversarial. Every passing year is another year of deferred structure, another year of deepening exposure, another year of the gap between income and security quietly widening beneath a surface that looks unchanged. Time, in that condition, is something to be outrun. But with structure being built deliberately, however incrementally, the relationship reverses. Time becomes what it was always capable of being, a compounding force working in your direction. The patient, invisible accumulation of small structural decisions over years produces something that no single large decision could have created. Time, given something sound to work on, is the most powerful financial tool available to anyone. There is an image worth holding here. A tree does not announce its root system. It does not defend it, advertise it, or draw attention to the depth it has been quietly building over years beneath the surface. It simply grows the roots, unhurried, through ordinary seasons and unremarkable days, until the storm arrives and the roots are simply there, invisible until the moment they become everything. Financial maturity has something of this quality. It is not built in dramatic gestures. It is built in the accumulation of oriented decisions made over time, most of which are invisible to anyone watching from the outside, all of which are contributing to something that will hold when conditions demand it. Maturity in financial life looks less like a transformation and more like a settling, a quieter relationship with money, less reactive to its fluctuations, less comparative with others who appear to have more or to have arrived somewhere sooner, less driven by the restless need to prove security through visible signals, or to earn one's way out of a discomfort that more earning was never going to resolve. The person who has genuinely internalized the structural framework doesn't stop caring about income. They simply stop confusing it with the destination. Income becomes a tool again, properly understood, powerful, necessary, and insufficient on its own. The destination is what the tool has been used to build. Self-trust, in this context, is a specific thing. It is not the confidence that arrives when the income is high and the lifestyle is impressive and everything appears to be working. That confidence is real but contingent. It depends on conditions remaining favorable. The self-trust that emerges from structural clarity is grounded differently. It is the assurance of a person who understands the system they are operating, who can see the gap and the path toward closing it, and who has made a genuine internal commitment to the foundational work, regardless of how the surface of the life looks in any given month. That kind of trust does not borrow from circumstances. It comes from orientation. The Sunday evenings do get quieter, not because perfection has been achieved. It hasn't, and it won't be, because financial life is long and variable and does not resolve into permanent stillness. They get quieter because the orientation is sound, because the work being done is the right work, because the anxiety, having delivered its message, has been given permission to rest. That quietness is not an ending. It is the feeling of a foundation being built beneath a life that deserved one all along. There is a particular kind of wisdom that doesn't feel like wisdom when it first arrives. It feels like relief, like the quiet exhale of a person who has been holding tension in a place they didn't know was tense, and who finally, after a long time, gets to put it down. That is what genuine financial clarity feels like when it reaches all the way to the root of the problem. Not the sharp satisfaction of a complicated answer, but the simpler, steadier feeling of a confusion finally dissolved. Let's state the core of it plainly, because it deserves to be heard without ornamentation. A high income is a remarkable tool, perhaps the most powerful financial tool available to a person in the ordinary course of a working life. It creates options. It resolves emergencies. It funds the life and enables the future. None of that is diminished by anything in this audiobook, but a tool, however sophisticated, however powerful, is entirely defined by what it is used to build. A precise instrument in the hands of someone without a blueprint does not produce precision. It produces activity. And activity, sustained over years without architectural intention, produces a life that is full of evidence of effort and thin on evidence of structure. This is the universal principle beneath the specific problem this audiobook has examined. Financial security has never been a function of how much flows through a life. It has always been a function of how much of what flows through is caught, shaped, and made durable. The volume of the river is not the measure of wealth. The integrity of what holds the river is. And this principle does not apply only to high earners, or only to a particular income bracket, or only to a specific stage of professional life. It applies wherever income exists without the deliberate infrastructure to give it lasting form, which, as this audiobook has shown, is more common among successful people than the visible surface of their lives would ever suggest. The confusion between income and wealth is worth examining one final time, not to repeat what has already been understood, but to release the last of its weight. This confusion is not a personal failure. It is not evidence of financial naivety or professional short-sightedness. It is a systemic misunderstanding, one that an entire professional culture quietly perpetuates by measuring success in compensation, rewarding income growth, above all other financial metrics, and never quite getting around to teaching the difference between a high-performing income and a structurally sound financial life. The high earner who arrives at this audiobook carrying unease is not a cautionary tale. They are the predictable output of a system that optimized them for exactly the wrong measure. Recognizing that is not an excuse. It is an accurate diagnosis. An accurate diagnosis, as this entire audiobook has argued, is where genuine resolution begins. If there is a single realization worth carrying from everything explored here, it is this: you were never underpaid. You were understructured. Those are not the same problem. They do not have the same solution. A person who is underpaid needs more income, and more income will address the condition directly. A person who is understructured needs architecture, needs the deliberate, patient, unglamorous work of building beneath the income what the income alone was never going to build for itself. Chasing more income to resolve a structural deficit is the longest possible route to the destination, and for many people, it never arrives at all. The reorientation from income thinking to structural thinking is not a small adjustment. It is a fundamental change in what the financial life is being built toward and what tools are being used to build it. Charlie Munger observed that it's not supposed to be easy. Anyone who finds it easy is stupid. He was speaking about investing, but the principle extends further. Building something durable is not easy. It does not have the immediate feedback loop that income growth provides. It does not produce visible markers of progress that the professional world recognizes and rewards. It is quiet work, foundation work, the kind that happens beneath the surface and reveals its value slowly, over years, in the increasing steadiness of a life that was deliberately constructed rather than simply maintained. But it is the work. It has always been the work. And now, having listened to this audiobook in its entirety, you know why? Not as a concept to be agreed with, but as a truth that has been felt, recognized, and integrated into the way financial life is perceived from this point forward. The river was never the problem. The river was always the gift. Strong, capable, consistent. Everything a financial foundation requires to work with. The banks were always the work. They still are. And now you are ready to build them. There are books you read and forget. There are ideas you encounter and agree with in the moment, and then set down somewhere on the way back to the ordinary demands of an ordinary week and never quite pick up again. This audiobook was written with the hope of being something different, not because of any particular brilliance in its construction, but because the problem it addresses is real enough and personal enough and quietly costly enough that the understanding it offers has somewhere meaningful to land. Thank you for staying with it. Not as a passive listener moving through content, but as someone willing to sit with an uncomfortable diagnosis long enough to let it become a useful one. That willingness is not trivial. It is, in many ways, the thing that separates people who accumulate insight from people who accumulate change. The insight was always available. The willingness to receive it honestly, without defensiveness, without the protective instinct to explain it away, is what made it possible for it to become something more than information. If only one thing travels forward with you from everything explored in these pages, let it be this: the shift from measuring what arrives to building what holds. Not a technique, not a tactic, not a new category in a spreadsheet or a revised budget or a financial product to be purchased. A reorientation in how the financial life is perceived, in what question is asked before a decision is made, in what metric is used to assess whether progress is actually occurring. That reorientation, applied consistently and without drama over the months and years ahead, will produce a financial life that looks, from the inside, fundamentally different from the one that caused the unease this audiobook began with. What changes from here will not be loud. It will not produce immediate visible evidence that something significant has shifted. The work of building financial infrastructure is, by its nature, invisible in the early stages, happening beneath the surface, accumulating without fanfare, contributing to a foundation that reveals its strength not in ordinary weather, but in the storms that eventually find every life. You will not feel dramatically different next week. You may not feel dramatically different next month. But something will be different in the quality of attention brought to financial decisions, in the questions asked before choices are made, in the growing, quiet confidence of a person who is no longer managing flow and calling it progress, but building structure and knowing the difference. This is how real foundations are always built. Not in a single decisive moment, but in the compounding of small, oriented decisions made consistently over time by someone who understands what they are constructing and why. The invisibility of this process is not a weakness. It is the nature of durable things. What can be built quickly can be dismantled quickly. What takes time to build tends to take time to threaten. The patience required is not passive. It is the active, engaged patience of a person doing real work in the right direction, trusting that time, given something sound to compound, will do its part. The structural deficit that brought you to this audiobook is not a permanent condition. It is a gap, specific, addressable, and responsive to exactly the kind of thinking that built the income in the first place, redirected toward the architecture that income alone was never going to build. You have the capability. You always had the capability. What was missing was not intelligence or discipline or financial sophistication. What was missing was the clarity to see the right problem and the framework to address it at the right level. Both of those things now exist in a way they didn't when you pressed play. The Sunday evenings ahead will not all be quiet. Life is long and variable, and financial life moves through seasons that do not always cooperate with the best intentions. But there is a steadiness available to you now that was not accessible before, the steadiness of a person who knows what they are building, who understands the system they are operating, and who has made a genuine internal shift from the orientation that created the deficit to the one that will, over time, close it. Go build something worthy of what you earn, not as an exhortation, as a quiet, grounded invitation from one thoughtful person to another, to take the clarity achieved here and let it do what clarity is designed to do. Not to inspire, to direct, not to motivate, to orient. The river is strong. It has always been strong. Now build the banks.